Imagine standing on a really busy sidewalk right in the middle of Midtown Manhattan.
Oh, yeah.
You've got a coffee in your hand. The yellow cabs are just blurring past you. The subway's doing that thing where it rumbles right beneath the grates.
Right, that classic New York sound.
Exactly. And the noise of the city is just this constant thrumming bass line. But then you just stop. You tilt your head back. You look straight up.
And it just goes on forever.
It really does. You're watching the glass, the steel, and the terracotta, and it's stretching thousands of feet into the sky, literally slicing into the clouds. And, I mean, if you've ever walked down those streets and felt completely dwarfed by the sheer scale of it all, you have to wonder, how exactly did this specific skyline come to be?
It's a great question.
Right. Like, how did a rugged island, just forests and hills and marshes, turn into the ultimate vertical metropolis? So today we are taking a deep dive into the very DNA of the New York skyline.
I'm very excited for this one.
Yeah, we've pulled together some incredible sources. We've got historical blueprints, a really detailed architectural timeline from the New York architectural story, and this comprehensive archives guide that covers 50 must-see New York City spaces.
Those are fantastic resources.
They really are. So our mission today is to figure out exactly how this happened. We're going to trace this evolution from its, humble Dutch roots all the way to the mind-bending, super slender pencil towers of the 21st century. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, it is a question that completely changes how you experience the city because when you really look at it, the skyline isn't just some random collection of tall buildings competing for your attention.
Right, it's not just an accident.
Not at all. It is a physical, totally readable record of human ambition. It's like a fossil layer of incredible technological innovation and of profound societal shifts over hundreds of years.
Oh, I love that. A fossil layer.
Yeah, because every gargoyle, every glass panel, every little setback, it all tells a story of a specific problem that someone had to solve.
And I think the best place to start solving that mystery is by actually looking down before we look up.
I completely agree.
Because New York wasn't just handed a blank canvas. If we rewind the clock, like all the way back to the 17th century, the city's architectural heritage actually begins with early Dutch colonial buildings.
Yes, exactly.
And according to our sources, the oldest surviving structure in New York City is actually the Wyckoff House in Brooklyn, built around 1652.
Yeah.
But, I mean, when I look at photos of the Wyckoff House, it just looks like a simple wooden farmhouse with a pitched roof. It really doesn't scream New York to me.
Well, you have to remember that New Amsterdam was, it was basically a frontier trading post at that time.
Right. They weren't building skyscrapers yet.
No, the architecture was entirely utilitarian. They were using wattle and daub, heavy timber framing, and, pretty much whatever local wood they could chop down.
Just working with what they had.
Exactly. But that reliance on wood is actually what sets up the very first massive architectural pivot for the city. Because as the city grew and transitioned into the federal style...
Oh, wait, the federal style. Just to visualize that for everyone. That means those symmetrical brick row houses, right?
Right.
The ones with the flat facades, subtle classical details, dormer windows, the kind you still see in parts of Greenwich Village.
Yes, exactly those. But even with that brick exterior, wood was still everywhere. It was in the framing, the roofs, all the interior structures. And that, unfortunately, brings us to the Great Fire of 1835.
Right, which fundamentally changed the physical texture of the city. We often think of architecture as being driven by, like, an artistic vision.
Yeah.
But in this case, it was driven by absolute catastrophe.
Precisely. It was December 1835, and a fire broke out in a warehouse in Lower Manhattan, and it was the middle of a brutal winter. The East River was completely frozen solid.
Oh, wow, so they couldn't even get water.
They tried. When the firefighters tried to pump water, it literally froze inside their hoses.
That is insane.
It was a disaster. The fire wiped out hundreds of buildings across 50 acres of the financial district. They eventually had to, and this is crazy, they had to use gunpowder from the Brooklyn Navy Yard to blow up buildings in the fire's path.
Wait, really? They were blowing up their own buildings?
Yeah, just to create a rubble break and stop the fire from spreading any further.
That is genuinely terrifying.
Yeah.
So the city basically wakes up the next morning, looks at the ashes, and says, okay, absolutely no more wood.
Pretty much. The government stepped in and heavily limited wood frame construction in dense areas. They essentially established stone and brick as the mandatory building materials of choice, strictly for safety.
Makes sense.
But this created a massive logistical puzzle Because unlike Paris, which, Paris was built for centuries using its own local creamy limestone bedrock that they pulled right from beneath the city.
Right, the catacombs and all that?
Exactly. New York didn't have that luxury. The bedrock of Manhattan, which is called Manhattan schist, is incredible for supporting skyscrapers because it's so hard. But it's way too hard and difficult to carve into beautiful building facades.
So they had to outsource their entire city facade.
They really
They
did.
had to pull building materials from this, like, far-flung network of quarries. The sources mentioned they were bringing in white marble via train all the way from Vermont, granite from Minnesota.
Yes, a massive undertaking.
And in the days before rail was completely ubiquitous, they were floating stone down the Hudson River on sloops or, dragging it along the Atlantic seaboard.
And that massive logistical network is exactly what gives New York its incredible chaotic variety of textures and hues. But the most significant import of all, particularly for the residential neighborhoods, was Connecticut brownstone.
Which is funny to me because it's a material from a completely different state, yet it becomes the defining aesthetic of historic Brooklyn and Harlem. Why brownstone? Like, what was the mechanism behind that obsession?
So, brownstone is a type of Triassic sandstone. The reason it became insanely popular in the mid to late 19th century is that it is incredibly soft and easy to carve when it's first quarried out of the earth.
Oh, so it's easy to work with.
Extremely. You could easily carve these elaborate, romantic, Italianate flourishes, thick windowsills, heavy cornices, those really ornate stoops.
Yeah, the classic New York stoop.
Exactly. Plus, with the Industrial Revolution, they could finally use steam-powered machines to slice the stone into very thin veneers. Builders would just build a cheap brick house and basically glue a thin layer of brownstone right in the front.
Oh, it was a veneer. It wasn't solid brownstone.
Mostly, yes. It became so ubiquitous that the word brownstone stopped being just a geological term. It became entirely synonymous with the term row house.
That is fascinating. Okay, so they've got the materials figured out, but they still need to organize the chaos. And this is where we hit a political decision that basically locked in the city's destiny, right? The Commissioner's Plan of 1811, the legendary master grid.
Oh, the 1811 grid. It was a visionary, if ruthlessly rigid, proposal to develop Manhattan north of 14th Street. A surveyor named John Randall Jr. spent years mapping the island.
Just walking through the swamps and hills, mapping it all out.
Basically, yeah. And the commissioners laid out exactly 12 numbered avenues running north and south, and 155 orthogonal cross streets running east to west.
And the reasoning behind it was completely devoid of romance. Like, it wasn't about creating beautiful plazas or grand boulevards like you see in European capitals.
No, not at all.
It was designed purely for economic logic. The grid's strict mathematical regularity provided the most efficient means possible to buy, sell, subdivide, and develop real estate. It created a standardized unit of urban space.
It did. But we also have to acknowledge that it required immense destruction. Manhattan wasn't flat. It was covered in massive hills, deep ravines, winding streams.
It had actual geography.
Right. To implement the grid, they had to essentially dynamite and flatten the entire topography of the island. They filled in the swamps, leveled the hills. Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary who would later design Central Park, he deeply despised the 1811 grid.
He really hated it, didn't he?
He argued it completely ignored the natural beauty and drainage of the land, prioritizing a developer's ledger over the human experience.
It really makes you wonder, what if Olmsted had his way? What if the 1811 grid had never been adopted and the whole city looked more like the irregular, winding, organic streets of Greenwich Village or maybe London?
It's a fascinating counterfactual. I mean, if you have irregular plots of land, you get irregular buildings, you get dead ends, awkward intersections, bottleneck traffic. You certainly don't get the maximum repeatable density required to support the massive population boom that New York experienced in the late 19th and 20th centuries.
So the grid was necessary for the density.
Absolutely. The grid forced architects to design within extremely rigid, standardized rectangular lots, usually 25 feet wide by 100 feet deep.
You know, I always think of the 1811 grid as being like a computer motherboard. It's rigid, it's mathematical, and it was just sitting there waiting for the hardware of the buildings to be plugged into it.
That's a great analogy.
But here's where I want to challenge the narrative a bit. Did the grid's sheer obsession with economic efficiency actually create the skyscraper? By boxing developers in horizontally, did it leave them with literally no choice but to look up?
Well, not exactly. The grid created the immense economic pressure for the skyscraper, but it didn't create the launching pad itself.
What do you mean?
Without the bedrock physics of that hard Manhattan schist we mentioned earlier, all that vertical pressure would have just resulted in heavy buildings sinking straight into the mud. You needed the geology. But you also needed a profound leap in technology, because as businesses flocked to the city, they completely ran out of horizontal space within those 25 by 100-foot grid rectangles. The only direction left was vertical.
Right. But you can't build a 50-story building out of solid stone.
Exactly, because of the weight. If you build a massive stone tower, the base walls have to be ridiculously thick just to support the masonry above it. You'd have no floor space left on the ground level. It would just be a solid block of stone.
So you could build high, but the building would be useless.
Exactly. So the first critical piece of technology was the advancement in steel frame construction, specifically utilizing the Bessemer process, which made mass-producing strong steel viable.
Okay, so steel changes everything.
It does. Instead of the walls holding up the building, architects created a rigid steel skeleton inside the building. The exterior walls were no longer structural. They were just, curtains hanging off the steel frame to keep the weather out.
But a steel frame doesn't matter if nobody wants to rent the top floor.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second, arguably more important innovation, the safety elevator.
Yes. Elisha Otis, 1854 at the World's Fair in New York. Elevators existed before Otis, but they were mostly for freight, and they were incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, people didn't want to ride in them.
No. If the hoisting rope snapped, the elevator plummeted. People were terrified of them.
And the way Otis proved his invention is one of the greatest marketing stunts in history. So he stands on an open elevator platform at the Crystal Palace exhibition. He hoists himself up high above the crowd.
Setting the stage.
Yeah, and then he literally orders a man with an axe to sever the rope holding him up. The crowd gasps, expecting him to just fall to his death. But the platform drops maybe an inch and completely stops. And Otis tips his hat and says, "All safe, gentlemen. All safe."
It's a legendary moment. And what Otis invented was a locking mechanism. It was this spring-loaded system that, if the tension on the rope failed, immediately engaged teeth into the guide rails on the sides of the shaft.
Such a simple but brilliant idea.
And it changed everything. You can't ask people to climb 30 flights of stairs in a business suit. The safety elevator was the psychological and practical key to the vertical revolution. Suddenly, the top floor wasn't the cheapest, worst space in the building because of the stairs. It became the penthouse, the most expensive, most desirable space.
So with the steel skeleton and the safety elevator, we get the early pioneers. And you really can't talk about early New York skyscrapers without talking about the Flatiron Building, completed in 1902 by Daniel Burnham.
A classic.
It's only 22 stories, which is tiny by today's standards, but it's totally iconic for that sharp triangular wedge shape.
The Flatiron is a perfect example of a building directly responding to a glitch in the grid. Broadway is the one major street in Manhattan that completely ignores the 1811 grid. It cuts diagonally across the island, basically following an old Native American trail.
Oh, I didn't realize it was an old trail.
Yeah. And where Broadway intersects 5th Avenue at 23rd Street, it creates this very sharp, awkward, triangular lot. Burnham maximized every single inch of that triangle. He used a steel frame and clad it in a beautiful rusticated limestone and terracotta facade with Renaissance details.
It proved that non-rectangular buildings could become these beloved landmarks. Although, interestingly, our sources point out it also created some accidental physics.
Yes, the winds.
Right. Because of its shape and its height relative to the surrounding buildings, it created massive wind downdrafts on 23rd Street. The winds would whip around the prow of the building, famously blowing off men's hats and blowing up women's skirts, much to the delight of loitering locals.
It was an early lesson in urban aerodynamics, but, the ambition didn't stop there. Just a decade later, in 1913, you get the Woolworth Building, designed by Cass Gilbert. It soared to an unprecedented 792 feet.
Now, this one is fascinating to me because it's essentially a corporate vanity project masquerading as a religious monument. It's actually nicknamed the Cathedral of Commerce.
It really was.
It has neo-Gothic terracotta detailing, pointed arches, flying buttresses, and literal gargoyles. But instead of the gargoyles warding off evil spirits, some of them are actually caricatures of Frank Woolworth himself counting his dimes.
That's my favorite detail.
They took the architectural language of European cathedrals and just slapped it onto a corporate office building.
It represents a profound societal shift. I mean, the tallest buildings in a city used to be the church spires. Now, the tallest buildings belong to retail magnates and insurance companies.
Money became the new religion.
Basically. But this incredible race to the sky quickly created a major urban crisis. Developers realized that if they owned a piece of the grid, they owned the air rights all the way up to the heavens. They were building these massive structures straight up from their lot lines, maximizing every single cubic inch of their property.
Which sounds great for the developer, but terrible for the pedestrian. And the tipping point for this was the Equitable Building, completed in 1915. It was this massive, bulky structure that rose vertically 40 stories right from the sidewalk.
Just a sheer wall.
Right, no tapering, no architectural grace, just a giant 40-story wall blocking out the sun.
The Equitable Building basically plunged the surrounding streets and neighboring buildings into permanent darkness. It cast a shadow for blocks. The property values of the buildings around it completely plummeted because their windows now just looked out at a dark brick wall.
That would be so depressing.
People were genuinely terrified. They thought Manhattan was going to become this dark, lightless canyon filled with stale air and disease.
And if you've ever walked down a street in the financial district at noon in November and wondered why it feels like midnight, you are experiencing the exact crisis that sparked the 1916 zoning laws. The city had to step in and basically govern the sky.
And they did it through a mathematical formula. The 1916 zoning resolution required that new buildings contain setbacks.
How did that work exactly?
Well, it worked like this. A building could rise straight up from the lot line for a certain number of stories, dictated by the width of the street it was on. But after that specific height, the building had to progressively withdraw or step back at a defined angle.
Oh, okay.
It essentially created an invisible slanted line rising from the center of the street that the building could not penetrate. The entire purpose was to preserve a view of the sky and allow sunlight and fresh air to actually reach the sidewalks below.
But the unintended consequence of this law is what makes New York architecture so famous. The law didn't say you must design your building in an Art Deco style. It just dictated the maximum allowable volume.
Right, it was just math.
But by forcing architects into this specific mathematical envelope, it essentially birthed a unified architectural movement. It created that iconic wedding cake, silhouette wide at the base, stepping up in tiers and finishing with a slender tower that we now associate perfectly with the New York skyline.
It's truly one of the greatest examples in history of constraints breeding creativity. The architects took these legally required setbacks and turned them into dramatic, tapered crowns and beautifully proportioned terraces.
They made the math look good.
Exactly. And this set the stage for the Roaring Twenties, which saw a literal frantic race to the sky. As the stock market roared just before the 1929 crash, developers and corporations were publicly, aggressively competing for the ultimate bragging right, the title of the world's tallest building.
And this is where the drama gets unbelievable. The rivalry between 40 Wall Street and the Chrysler Building is it's like a modern-day tech race, where one company reveals a hidden feature at the absolute last second to crush their competitor. So, set the stage for us.
Yeah.
1929.
Right, so in downtown Manhattan, you have 40 Wall Street, the Bank of Manhattan building, designed by H. Craig Severance. They are building at an astonishing pace, completing it in a record 11 months.
11 months is crazy.
It is. In May of 1930, they top out at 927 feet. They hold a press conference, they celebrate, they firmly believe they have won the crown.
But meanwhile, up in Midtown, at Lexington Avenue and 42nd Street, you have auto executive Walter Chrysler and his architect William Van Alen. And Van Alen used to be Severance's business partner before they had a bitter falling out.
Oh, yes. So this is deeply personal.
Very personal. They are building the Chrysler Building. And it is gorgeous. It has this incredible Art Deco design with literal metal gargoyles modeled after Chrysler Plymouth hood ornaments. And that famous shimmering terraced crown with sunburst motifs made of Narosta's stainless steel.
But Chrysler and Van Alen knew that 40 Wall Street was going to beat their announced height, so they executed a brilliant, entirely secret plan. Inside the building's central fire shaft, completely hidden from the public and from their rivals downtown, they secretly assembled a 185-foot, 27-ton steel spire.
The logistics of that are just wild. They build a giant metal needle inside a tube hundreds of feet in the air.
It's incredible.
And once 40 Wall Street topped out and claimed victory, Van Alen just gave the order. In a span of just 90 minutes, they hoisted this massive needle up through the roof, riveting it into place.
90 minutes.
It pushed the Chrysler Building to 1,046 feet, instantly stealing the crown and becoming the first structure in human history to surpass the 1,000-foot threshold.
It was a monumental triumph of corporate branding, engineering deception, and Art Deco exuberance. But here is the real tragedy of that race. The victory was incredibly short-lived, because just a few blocks away, an even larger giant was already rising. In May of 1931, exactly a year later, both of them were completely crushed by the Empire State Building.
Designed by Shreve, Lamb, and Harmon. It reaches a staggering 12,250 feet with 102 stories. And remarkably, it was built in just 14 months. 14 months. I mean, today you can barely get a permit to remodel a bathroom in 14 months, let alone build the tallest building in the world. How on earth did they do that?
It was a masterpiece of logistics. They basically invented modern construction management. They used just-in-time delivery. The steel beams were manufactured in Pennsylvania, put on trains, moved to trucks, and hoisted into place, sometimes within 80 hours of leaving the steel mill.
That is just phenomenal coordination.
They even built a miniature railway system inside the building to move materials across the floors. It was literally an assembly line pointing straight up into the sky.
Now, I want to push back on something we discussed a minute ago regarding the 1916 zoning law.
Okay, sure.
We praise it for giving us this beautiful Art Deco wedding cake aesthetic. But was it actually a brilliant piece of urban design? Or was it just a desperate Band-Aid that architects happened to make look beautiful?
Yeah.
Because if you look at the streets around the Empire State Building, they are still incredibly dark and congested.
That's a very fair critique, and urban planners debate it to this day. The 1916 zoning law was absolutely a reactive measure. It was a Band-Aid applied only after the equitable building proved how disastrous unregulated capitalism could be for the public realm.
Right. It didn't solve everything.
It didn't solve congestion at all. It just mitigated the darkness. But what makes it successful in retrospect is that it provided a rigid mathematical framework that architects were able to interpret romantically. And speaking of the Empire State Building, it's really important to understand its socioeconomic context. It opened in 1931, right as the Great Depression took a vicious hold on the country.
Right. It was actually nicknamed the Empty State Building because
Yeah.
they couldn't rent out the office space for years.
Exactly. But despite the financial failure of its early years, it held the title of the world's tallest building for roughly 40 years. Standing there during the Depression and World War II, it was more than just real estate. It was a monumental symbol of American resilience.
It was proof we could still do big things.
Exactly. It was a psychological anchor for the city. It proved that even in the darkest economic times, humans could still achieve the impossible.
But as we move past World War II, the architectural mood shifts drastically. The Depression and the war completely changed how people view the world. The extravagance of the Art Deco period, the ornate masonry, the gargoyles, the expensive stainless steel sunbursts, suddenly felt frivolous.
Yes, it felt out of touch.
It felt heavy and tied to a bygone era. The post-war era stripped all of that away, leading to a sleek new aesthetic.
We are talking about the rise of the international style. The architectural philosophy shifted from the exuberance and historical referencing of Art Deco to the strict, austere functionalism championed by European modernist architects, primarily Ludwig Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier.
The famous less is more.
Yes, the motto famously coined by Mies. They believed that the structural skeleton of the building was inherently beautiful and that slapping fake gargoyles and Greek columns on a modern steel building was fundamentally dishonest.
I like to think of modernism as stripping a car down to just its engine and chassis for pure, unadulterated efficiency. It's intellectual, it's clean, but it's cold.
That's a good way to put it.
Our sources highlight 3 buildings that really introduced this shock to the New York system. First, you had the United Nations headquarters in 1952, led by Wallace K. Harrison, with heavy conceptual input from Le Corbusier. It gave us the Secretary Tower. For a city used to tiered wedding cakes, suddenly here's this massive, perfectly rectangular, unornamented slab of green-tinted glass and steel.
It was revolutionary, but it also exposed the flaws of early modernism. Putting a giant unshaded glass wall facing east and west over the East River meant the building acted like a giant greenhouse.
Oh, no.
Yeah, the early air conditioning systems had to work incredibly hard just to keep the diplomats from boiling alive in the afternoon sun.
Form over function, maybe.
A bit, yes. But aesthetically, the die was cast. Then you get Lever House, also finished in 1952, designed by Gordon Bunshaft of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill.
Lever House is fascinating because it was built for a soap company. And what is the aesthetic of soap? Cleanliness? Hygiene?
Exactly.
The building was a pioneering all-glass office tower that looked like a sparkling, immaculate cube. It didn't even fill its entire zoning envelope. It was this thin blue-green glass slab that seemed to just float above an open, shaded ground floor plaza. It was the ultimate corporate flex. Like, we're so rich we don't even need to build on our entire lot.
And that concept of the plaza leads us to the absolute masterpiece of this era. The Seagram Building, completed in 1958 by Mies van der Rohe himself alongside Philip Johnson. It is a 38-story tower famed for its incredibly disciplined, dark, bronze and topaz glass curtain wall.
Wait, slow down there. Architectural texts always rave about the Seagram Building's facade. They say Mies van der Rohe used extruded bronze mullions. For anyone who isn't a licensed architect, what exactly are we looking at there, and why did he care so much about them?
Great question. A mullion is simply the vertical bar between panes of glass in a window. In modern skyscrapers, they help hold the massive glass panels in place against wind pressure.
Okay, simple enough.
Now, Mies believed in structural honesty. He wanted you to look at the outside of the building and understand the steel skeleton holding it up on the inside. But American building codes required the actual structural steel beams to be covered in concrete to prevent them from melting in a fire.
So he couldn't show the real steel skeleton.
Exactly. So to achieve the look of structural honesty, he essentially faked it. He faked structural honesty? That's hilarious.
He really did. He designed non-structural vertical I-beams made of solid bronze, manufactured through extrusion, which is pushing hot metal through a die to get a specific shape, and he bolted them to the outside of the building. They run vertically up the entire facade.
Wow.
They don't hold the building up at all, but they give the eye a sense of vertical thrust and texture. And because they are real bronze, they have to be rubbed down with oil by window washers every single year so they don't oxidize and turn green like the Statue of Liberty.
Oh, that's wild. It's the epitome of luxurious corporate modernism.
It really is.
Okay, so I completely get the intellectual appeal of less is more, and the Seagram Building sounds bespoke and gorgeous. But I have to ask, did the international style accidentally ruin the charm of the city?
What do you mean?
Suddenly, cheap developers realized that building a flat glass box was astronomically cheaper than hiring Italian artisans to carve limestone gargoyles. They didn't build Seagram masterpieces. They built cheap, generic, sterilizing glass boxes everywhere. You've hit on the exact backlash that eventually occurred. The international style, when executed by a master with an unlimited budget like the Seagram liquor fortune, is breathtaking. But when it was copied cheaply, and it was copied relentlessly across 6th Avenue and the financial district, it led to a brutal sterilization of the urban landscape.
It's like the city lost its texture.
It stripped the city of its tactile, human-scale details. And this clash between the old world of ornate masonry and the new world of brutal efficiency culminated in the greatest architectural tragedy in New York's history, the demolition of the original Pennsylvania station in 1963.
This one hurts to even talk about. If you go to Penn Station today, you were just scurrying like a rat through low-ceiling, fluorescent-lit underground tunnels. But the original Penn Station, completed in 1910, was a McKim Mead and White masterpiece.
It was stunning.
It was the absolute pinnacle of the Beaux-Arts style. Grand, sweeping spaces, pink granite, travertine marble. The main waiting room was modeled after the Roman baths of Caracalla, with these 150-foot vaulted glass ceilings. It was a civic monument that made you feel important just by walking into it.
The famous quote from architectural historian Vincent Scully is, "One entered the city like a god. One scuttles in now like a rat."
So accurate. So why was it torn down?
It wasn't because people hated the architecture, it was purely economic. By the 1960s, the Pennsylvania Railroad was going bankrupt due to the rise of the automobile and the airplane. That massive, gorgeous station was incredibly expensive to heat, clean, and maintain. So they sold the air rights above the tracks.
And their solution was to just tear the entire Roman masterpiece down above ground, throw the rubble into the Secaucus swamps in New Jersey, and build the drum-shaped Madison Square Garden Arena and a generic modernist office complex right on top of the tracks.
It was met with organized protests. Architects rallied, citizens held signs, but they failed. The destruction of Penn Station was called an act of irresponsible public vandalism.
Just heartbreaking.
But if there is a silver lining, and it is a monumental one, it's that this specific heartbreaking loss was the catalyst for the modern historic preservation movement in America. The public outrage was so visceral that it directly led the mayor to sign the 1965 New York City Landmarks Law, creating the Landmarks Preservation Commission.
Right, which finally gave the city the legal power to stop private owners from destroying historically significant buildings.
Yeah.
And that commission Famously went on to save Grand Central Terminal from suffering the exact same fate in the 1970s.
Yes, a battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court with Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis leading the charge.
It really makes you wonder, what if Penn Station had miraculously survived? What if the railroad had found a bailout? Would the historic preservation movement have ever gained the real legal teeth it needed? Or was a sacrificial lamb of that magnitude absolutely necessary to wake the city up to its own architectural mortality?
It's a deeply sobering thought. History heavily suggests that without a shock to the system as visceral as seeing those majestic pink granite columns reduced to rubble, the political will to restrict private property rights would never have materialized.
Right, because property rights are so ingrained here.
Exactly. In America, private property rights are sacred. To tell an owner, you cannot tear down your own building because it belongs to the cultural heritage of the city was a radical legal concept. That single event triggered a movement that retained over 1 million structures nationwide. Penn Station died so that thousands of other buildings could live.
And aesthetically, the backlash to the generic glass box eventually arrived too, in the form of postmodernism. If the international style is a brutal, hyper-efficient corporate spreadsheet, postmodernism is like writing that same corporate memo but sneaking in an inside joke about a Greek tragedy.
I love that analogy.
It's functional, but it's actively winking at history. It brought humor and color back to the skyline.
And the ultimate example of this pivot is the AT&T building, completed in 1984. And the irony here is delicious because it was designed by Philip Johnson, the exact same architect who helped Mies van der Rohe design the ultra-serious modernist Seagram building 30 years earlier.
Talk about an aesthetic 180. The AT&T building, which is now 550 Madison Avenue, was a highly controversial rebuke to the austere modernism Johnson himself had championed. He abandoned the sleek black glass. Instead, he clad the building in pink granite.
A total departure.
At the base, he put a massive multi-story arched entrance that looks almost Roman. But the thing that drove critics absolutely crazy was the roof.
The famous Chippendale roof. Instead of a flat modernist top, Johnson gave the skyscraper a broken pediment, a decorative shape with a gap in the top center, exactly like you would see on the top of an 18th century Chippendale grandfather clock.
It's hilarious. He basically put a piece of antique furniture on top of a 647-foot corporate tower.
Critics called it a joke, but it was a profoundly important joke. It signaled a return to historical references, to ornament, and to narrative. It proved that skyscraper design didn't have to be entirely devoid of humor, and that a building could engage in a historical dialogue rather than just worshiping industrial efficiency.
Okay, we spent a lot of time looking up. We've looked at these massive monuments of commerce, corporate ego, and architectural philosophy. But what about the ground game?
Let's talk about it.
They've essentially paved over the entire island in this relentless pursuit of density. But human beings aren't machines. You can't just stack them in cast iron boxes and glass towers and expect a healthy society. At what point did the city look at where New Yorkers actually live, breathe, and find peace? Let's bring our gaze back down to street level and look at the human scale of the city.
That is a vital shift in perspective, because the intense density we see in Manhattan was only survivable because the city expanded outward, creating distinct residential release valves. As New York grew, the advent of the ferry and eventually the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883 allowed the affluent to escape the squalor of lower Manhattan.
So they fled to the boroughs.
Exactly. Brooklyn Heights, for instance, perched on a bluff overlooking the harbor, is often credited as America's first suburb. It contains an exceptional collection of 19th century row houses, Federal, Greek Revival, Italianate offering fresh air and space while remaining commutable to Wall Street.
But not all residential neighborhoods were built for fresh air. Let's look at Soho. Today, it's famous for high-end boutiques and wealthy celebrities. But architecturally, it's an incredible story of adaptive reuse. Soho contains the world's largest collection of cast iron architecture. But these weren't built as luxury lofts. These were originally manufacturing and warehouse spaces built in the mid-19th century.
Right. Before cast iron, if you wanted to build a 5-story warehouse, you used thick brick or stone walls. The windows had to be relatively small, so you didn't weaken the structural integrity of the wall.
Because the wall itself was holding the building up.
Exactly. But cast iron changed the physics of the facade. Iron has incredible compressive strength. You could cast these slender, ornate iron columns in a foundry, ship them to the site, and bolt them together like a giant erector set. Because the iron columns were so strong and thin, the spaces between them could be filled with massive panes of glass.
It's almost like proto-modernism. They were basically ordering building facades out of catalogs. You could pick out a French Renaissance column, an Italianate cornice, bolt it all together, and paint it to look like stone.
It was incredibly efficient.
But the functional result was that these massive, sprawling windows allowed natural light to flood deep into the manufacturing floors, which was crucial before electric lighting was reliable.
Exactly. And decades later, in the 1960s and 70s, when the manufacturing industry abandoned New York, those buildings sat empty. Artists moved in illegally because the rent was dirt cheap, and they loved the massive windows and the vast, undivided floor plans for their studios.
The ultimate creative space.
That organic artist movement is what transformed those sweatshops into the insanely desirable residential lofts we know today. It's a perfect example of how the architectural infrastructure of one era dictates the aesthetic culture of the next.
And speaking of infrastructure dictating culture,
Yeah.
we have to talk about my favorite quirky detail of the New York skyline. The unseen networks that keep these neighborhoods alive.
Oh, I know where you're going with this.
If you look up at the roofs of many buildings across the city, particularly the older 6 to 10-story apartment buildings in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, you'll see thousands of wooden water towers. I absolutely love them.
They are very charming.
You look at this ultra-modern, high-tech city, and then there are these giant wooden barrels perched on the roofs that look like they belong on a farm in the 1800s. Why are they still there?
It is a brilliant intersection of physics and municipal engineering. In the 19th century, as buildings started creeping up past 5 or 6 stories, the city faced a plumbing crisis. The municipal water mains running under the streets operate at a specific pressure.
Okay.
If the city increased the pressure enough to blast water all the way up to the 10th floor of a new building, the pressure would be so high that the ancient underground pipes and the plumbing fixtures in lower-level apartments would literally explode.
Oh, wow. So the city basically said, we'll get the water to your ground floor, but getting it to the roof is your problem.
Precisely. They passed an ordinance requiring buildings higher than 6 stories to install their own rooftop tanks. So the solution is brilliantly low-tech. You use an electric pump in the basement to slowly push the water up to a holding tank on the roof at a low, manageable pressure.
And then gravity does the rest.
Exactly. When someone on the 8th floor turns on their shower, gravity pulls the water down from the tank, providing perfect, consistent water pressure.
But why are they still made of wood? Surely in 2026, we have better materials than cedar planks strapped together with steel bands.
You'd think so, but wood is actually superior for this specific job. Steel tanks are heavy, they rust, they freeze in the winter, and they heat the water up in the summer.
Oh, because wood is an insulator.
Exactly. Wood, specifically untreated cedar or redwood, acts as a natural insulator. It keeps the water from freezing in January, and it keeps it cool in August. And because the wood swells when it gets wet, it naturally seals its own leaks. They are cheaper to build, easier to maintain, and last for decades. They are built exactly the same way barrel makers made them over a century ago.
To me, the wooden water towers are like a secret language of the city. They are hiding in plain sight, totally analog, entirely unpretentious, yet they are quite literally keeping the modern metropolis hydrated.
That's a beautiful way to look at it.
But people don't just need water and shelter. They need psychological relief. They need nature. Which brings us back to Frederick Law Olmsted.
Yes, the Grand Park movement. We mentioned Olmsted and his partner Calvert Vaux earlier. While the 1811 grid was ruthlessly efficient at maximizing real estate, it left almost zero room for breathing space. The antidote was the creation of grand, engineered, natural landscapes.
Engineered nature.
Exactly. Everyone knows Central Park, but architectural historians often point to their later work, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, designed between 1866 and 1873, as their true masterpiece.
Really, more than Central Park.
Olmsted himself considered it superior to Central Park because he didn't have to fight the rigid rectangular boundaries or the crosstown traffic roads as aggressively.
And the incredible thing about Prospect Park is the deception of it. You walk into the long meadow, this massive, sweeping, mile-long stretch of grass bordered by trees, and you feel like you've stumbled into a pristine, untouched pastoral valley. But it is entirely manufactured.
Completely terraformed.
Every hill, every tree line, the ravine with its waterfalls, it was all created by thousands of workers moving earth. They used forced perspective to make the spaces look larger, curving the paths so you can never quite see the end of them. It's the ultimate architectural illusion of nature.
It is. They understood that the extreme geometry of the city caused psychological fatigue, and that the only cure was the complete visual absence of the city. But creating a massive 500-acre park isn't the only way to provide relief. As the 20th century progressed, land became too expensive for grand parks. This led to the concept of the pocket park, tiny surgical interventions within the grid.
And the gold standard for this is Paley Park, opened in 1967 in Midtown Manhattan. It is almost impossibly small, literally 1/10 of an acre, tucked between 3 buildings on 53rd Street.
Yeah.
If you aren't looking for it, you'll walk right past it.
Yeah.
But when you step inside, the temperature literally drops.
The design is a masterclass in sensory manipulation. You walk up a few steps, which psychologically separates you from the sidewalk. You are under a canopy of delicate honey locust trees that dapple the sunlight. But the defining feature is the 20-foot-high waterfall covering the entire back wall.
And it's not just a trickle, it's roaring. And the genius of that waterfall isn't just visual, it's acoustic. The sound frequencies of the rushing water are perfectly tuned to mask the low-frequency rumble of garbage trucks and taxis on the street.
It's acoustic engineering.
It completely drowns out the city. It provides this vital, immediate psychological relief for office workers eating their lunch. It makes me wonder, is it possible that the city's most successful architecture isn't actually the skyscrapers at all, but the empty spaces? The voids like Prospect Park and Paley Park.
It's a compelling philosophical argument. In architecture, the voids give the solids their power. The density of Manhattan is only tolerable because of the contrast provided by the parks. But we also have to acknowledge that creating space or renewing space has a very dark side in New York's history.
Right, urban renewal.
Yes, because the city eventually decided that the chaotic, organic, human scale of the old neighborhoods was obsolete. Beginning in the mid-20th century, we entered the era of urban renewal, championed almost entirely by one unelected city planner, Robert Moses.
Robert Moses is arguably the most powerful and controversial figure in the city's built history. He wasn't a mayor, he wasn't an architect, but he controlled the authorities that built the bridges, the highways, and the housing projects.
Yeah.
And his vision for the city was essentially to bulldoze the past, to make way for the automobile.
Moses subscribed to the Tower in the Park ideology championed by Le Corbusier. The idea was that tight, dense, chaotic tenement neighborhoods like the Lower East Side or East Harlem were slums that bred disease and crime.
So his solution was destruction.
His solution was to literally condemn and bulldoze entire historic communities, wiping out hundreds of blocks, and replace them with massive, identical brick high-rise public housing towers surrounded by sprawling lawns and highways.
But the irony is that, in trying to save the city, he arguably destroyed the very fabric that made the neighborhoods function. Those so-called slums he bulldozed actually had vibrant street life. They had local butchers, stoop culture, eyes on the street keeping the neighborhood safe. When you move everyone into an isolated tower and surround it with an empty lawn, you kill the street life.
And the legacy of those projects is highly contested and often tragic. Many suffered from inconsistent funding, poor maintenance, and because the open spaces lacked the organic surveillance of traditional streets, they became high-crime areas.
The lawns just became no man's lands.
Exactly. Not to mention his highway projects like the Cross Bronx Expressway, which literally cleaved vibrant, functioning neighborhoods in half, devastating the Bronx for generations. It is a stark, permanent reminder of the immense tension between top-down, sterile urban planning and the organic, messy, historic communities that actually live at the human scale.
You can't just pave over communities.
A city has to modernize, it has to breathe, but you can't force it to breathe by suffocating its history and displacing its most vulnerable people.
That tension between the past and the future is the perfect pivot point for us.
Yeah.
Because having seen how the city struggles to preserve its past, accommodate its people, and fix its mistakes, we finally need to look at the cutting edge. How is New York rewriting its skyline for the 21st century?
The defining architectural moment of the early 21st century for New York was, undeniably and tragically, the post-9/11 rebirth of Lower Manhattan. The destruction of the Twin Towers created a void in the skyline and a scar in the city's psyche.
It was a very difficult time to even think about building again.
The architectural response to rebuilding the World Trade Center site had to balance immense emotional weight, political infighting, and the demand for cutting-edge engineering and security.
And the centerpiece of that effort is One World Trade Center, completed in 2014 by architect David Childs of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. It's a fascinating building because it is trying to do so many things at once. It rises to a highly symbolic 1,776 feet. It's a modernist, crystalline design, but when you look closely at the base, it's essentially a bunker, isn't it?
It had to be. The first 185 feet of the building is a windowless, bomb-resistant concrete base designed to withstand a massive truck bomb. To prevent it from looking like a grim fortress, they clad that base in thousands of prismatic glass fins to catch the light.
It's like armor made of light.
Exactly. From that heavy base, the tower's square edges are chamfered back, tapering elegantly into 8 tall isosceles triangles, forming an octagon in the middle and resolving into a smaller square at the parapet. It manages to be heavily armored while appearing light and reflective.
And right next to it, providing a stark contrast to that modernist tower, you have Santiago Calatrava's Oculus's transportation hub, which opened in 2016. When you stand on the plaza, the Oculus looks like the bleached white rib cage of a massive prehistoric bird, or maybe a dove taking flight.
Calatrava is known for his zoomorphic designs architecture that mimics living forms. The Oculus was highly criticized, mainly because it suffered massive delays and its price tag ballooned to an astronomical $4 billion.
$4 billion for a train station.
Yes.
Yeah.
But architecturally, once you step inside, the engineering is undeniable. The soaring white steel ribs create a vast, column-free, cathedral-like space. A long skylight runs down the spine, positioned specifically so that every year on September 11th, at the time the second tower fell, a beam of sunlight aligns perfectly down the center of the concourse.
That is a stunning tribute.
It serves as a stark, sculptural, highly emotional contrast to the angular corporate glass towers around it.
But beyond the emotional rebuilding of Ground Zero, the 21st century has also ushered in a massive shift in how buildings consume resources. We are finally in the era of mandatory green design.
And it was long overdue. Skyscrapers are historically massive energy hogs. The shift towards sustainability became a driving force in modern aesthetics. We briefly mentioned the Condé Nast building in Times Square earlier, completed in 1999, which was a pioneer integrating environmentally friendly gas-fired chillers and massive recycling chutes.
But the Hearst Tower is really the standout, right?
The building that really stands out visually and technologically is definitely the Hearst Tower, completed in 2006 by Norman Foster.
The Hearst Tower is a brilliant example of modern green design in direct dialogue with history. So back in 1928, William Randolph Hearst built this beautiful 6-story cast stone Art Deco base for his publishing empire. He intended to build a tower on top of it, but the Great Depression hit, and he had to stop at 6 stories.
It just sat there unfinished.
It sat there for decades. When Norman Foster came in, he preserved the historic 1928 facade, gutted the inside, and then literally erupted a futuristic 46-story glass tower right out of the middle of the old base. It looks like a spaceship landed inside an antique museum.
The visual is striking, but the engineering of the tower is what makes it revolutionary. If you look at the glass facade, you'll see massive, diagonal, interlocking stainless steel triangles covering the whole building. This is called a diagrid structural frame.
Why triangles instead of the traditional vertical and horizontal steel grid we've been using since the 1890s?
Because triangles are inherently more rigid than rectangles. By using the diagrid to resist the wind loads and support the weight, Foster was able to eliminate the need for massive vertical columns on the perimeter. That specific engineering choice actually used 20% less steel than a conventionally framed building of the same height.
Wow, 20% is a lot of steel.
Less steel means less carbon used in manufacturing and transport. Combined with a roof system that collects rainwater to run the air conditioning, it became the city's first Gold ELE certified skyscraper.
It's beautiful and it's responsible. But I cannot say the same for the most controversial additions to the current skyline. If we're talking about the defining silhouette of the 2020s, we have to talk about the super slenders. The pencil towers, specifically along Billionaires Row just south of Central Park. These buildings, frankly, defy the laws of logic.
They are a phenomenon unique to this specific era of ultra-wealth and advanced engineering. The guides highlight 432 Park Avenue, designed by Raphael Vignoli. It's 1,396 feet tall, and it looks like a monumental, extruded, perfectly square concrete grid. It has a width-to-height ratio of 1:15.
And that ratio was quickly blown out of the water by the Steinway Tower at 111 West 57th Street, designed by Shop Architects. It reaches 1,428 feet, but it is incredibly skinny. It has a mind-bending height-to-width ratio of 24:1. It is officially the most slender skyscraper in the world.
It looks like a needle.
It does. But here's what I don't understand about the physics. If you build a stick of glass that tall and that thin, why doesn't the wind just snap it in half or blow it over during a hurricane?
The engineering miracles required to keep these buildings upright are staggering. When wind hits a tall, flat building, it creates swirling vortices, miniature tornadoes on the leeward side of the building that essentially suck the building side to side. It's called vortex shedding.
Miniature tornadoes, got it.
To fight this on a super slender building, engineers use two main tricks. First, aerodynamics. On 432 Park, you'll notice that every 12 floors, there are two entire floors left completely empty, open to the elements. These are blow-through floors. They allow the wind to literally pass right through the building, disrupting those dangerous vortices.
Okay, so you put holes in the sail to let the wind through. What's the second trick?
The second trick is combating harmonic resonance. Even with blow-through floors, a tower that's skinny is going to sway. If it sways too much, the billionaires on the 80th floor are going to get severe motion sickness. So engineers install massive tuned mass dampers near the roof.
What exactly is a tuned mass damper?
A tuned mass damper is essentially a giant, heavy pendulum. We're talking a solid steel or concrete block weighing hundreds of tons, suspended by cables and attached to hydraulic shock absorbers. When the wind pushes the building to the left, the massive pendulum, due to inertia, swings to the right.
Oh, it counteracts the movement.
It acts as a counterweight, absorbing the kinetic energy and damping the sway of the building to a tolerable level.
The physics of the pendulum fighting the wind is incredible, and I will admit, the Steinway Tower has a stunning facade. It uses terracotta and bronze on the sides that beautifully nod back to the 1920s Art Deco era, which I appreciate. But I have to push back on these super talls conceptually.
That's fair.
Are these pencil-thin towers really an engineering marvel we should celebrate? Or are they just a grotesque symptom of a city losing touch with the ground? Because these aren't office buildings employing thousands of New Yorkers. These are ultra-luxury condos, often bought as investment vehicles by absentee global owners. They sit empty half the year.
It's a very debated topic.
How does their extreme exclusivity impact the cultural fabric of the city? Compare them to the civic-minded skyscrapers of the past, like the Woolworth or Chrysler buildings. Those were proud corporate symbols meant to be engaged with and admired by the public. These new ones feel like gated communities in the clouds.
I think you've articulated the core tension of modern New York architecture perfectly. It is a very valid criticism. The early skyscrapers, while absolutely built for ruthless profit, still engaged the street level. They had opulent, publicly accessible lobbies, retail spaces, and transit connections. They contributed to the civic realm.
They felt like they belonged to New York.
The super slenders are heavily criticized as essentially being vertical safe deposit boxes in the sky for oligarchs. They cast incredibly long, cold shadows over Central Park while contributing almost nothing to the street-level vitality of the city. They represent the ultimate triumph of real estate mathematics over civic duty. It highlights the growing tension between hypercapitalism and the public realm.
Which is exactly why my favorite parts of the 21st century skyline aren't the super talls. I love that the modern era is also about shapeshifters and adaptive reuse. I like to compare some of these new projects to a Swiss Army knife. They don't just sit there like a static glass box. They actually do things. They move. Look at the Shed in Hudson Yards.
Designed by Diller Scofidio plus Renfro, the Shed is a masterclass in kinetic architecture. It is an art center that actively solves the problem of needing flexible space in a dense city. It features a massive, translucent outer shell made of ETFE panels.
Let me stop you there. ETFE panels. What is that? Why not just use glass?
Excellent point. ETFE stands for ethylene tetrafluoroethylene. It's a fluorine-based plastic. It is incredibly strong, lets in just as much light as glass, but it is a fraction of the weight. And crucially, it's virtually self-cleaning. Dirt just washes right off it in the rain.
Oh, that's clever.
Because the shell is so lightweight, the engineers were able to put the entire structure on actual bogies, massive steel wheels, exactly like you'd find on a freight train.
This is the crazy part. The building is on wheels.
Yes. The entire outer shell can physically roll out along a track over its adjoining public plaza. When it rolls out, it expands the footprint of the building to create a massive, temperature-controlled, enclosed performance hall that can hold thousands of people.
A transformer building.
When the performance is over, the motors kick in and the building slowly rolls back, retracting to its original size and returning the plaza to the public. It is literally a building that changes its physical volume on demand based on the needs of the city.
It's unbelievable. It feels like science fiction. And right next to it, you have the vessel, that 150-foot-tall climbable honeycomb of copper-colored staircases that looks like an M.C. Escher drawing. But maybe the greatest modern achievement in the city, the ultimate proof that New York can heal its own scars, is the High Line.
The High Line represents a total paradigm shift in urban thinking. For decades, the west side of Manhattan was defined by a massive, abandoned, rusting, elevated freight railway running right through the meatpacking district and Chelsea. It was an eyesore. The standard operating procedure for the city would be to demolish it and build condos.
But instead, local residents fought to save it. And they brought in landscape architects James Porterfield Operations, along with the architects of the Shed, Diller Scofidio plus Renfro. And they didn't just paint the steel and plant some grass. They leaned into the decay.
That's the genius of it. The High Line is the ultimate example of adaptive reuse. When the tracks were abandoned, nature had slowly reclaimed the steel. Wild seeds blew in, taking root in the gravel ballast. The designers looked at that rugged, spontaneous nature and said, let's amplify this.
They embraced the wildness.
They treated the decaying infrastructure as a living system. They carefully removed the tracks, waterproofed the structure, replaced the soil, and replanted a highly curated version of that wild landscape. They wove concrete plank pathways seamlessly into the gardens.
They turned industrial trash into absolute civic treasure. Walking the High Line is magical. You are 30 feet in the air, floating above the taxi horns, weaving through the architecture of the city. You walk right through the middle of an old Nabisco factory.
It's a totally unique perspective.
And the economic impact was staggering. It spurred massive, albeit gentrifying economic development all along the west side, and it inspired cities all over the world to look at their abandoned infrastructure and see parks instead of scrap metal.
It shows a city in constant, brilliant dialogue with its own past. It proves that New York doesn't always have to erase its history to build its future. Sometimes it can just plant a garden on top of it.
It really does. And that brings us to the end of this epic journey. We have traced the DNA of the skyline from the simple wattle and daub of the 1652 Wyckoff House and the ruthless flattening mathematics of the 1811 grid. We felt the heat of the 1835 fire that literally forced the city into an era of stone and imported brownstone.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We rode the Otis elevators up into the clouds during the roaring Art Deco race between the Chrysler and Empire State Buildings. We mourned the loss of Penn Station, a tragedy that birthed the modern preservation movement. And we explored the human scale, from Soho's cast iron to the secret analog lights of those wooden water towers.
And we can't forget the super talls.
Right. Finally arriving at today's shape-shifting arts centers, sustainable green diagrids, and those impossible super-slender pencil towers swaying on pendulums in the wind.
It's an overwhelming amount of history. But the greatest value in understanding this timeline and peeling back these layers is that the next time you look at a city skyline, whether you are standing in Manhattan or Chicago or London or Tokyo, you will realize you aren't just seeing static glass and steel.
What are they seeing?
A skyline is not a photograph. It is a movie playing in extreme slow motion. You are seeing the visible push and pull of zoning laws, the invisible battles against wind and gravity solved by structural engineers, and the endless reach of human imagination constantly trying to overcome the constraints of the physical world.
Beautifully said. You will never look at a tall building the same way again.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over as you walk through your own city. We just talked about how New Yorkers brilliantly adapted an abandoned, completely obsolete 19th century railway into the beloved High Line. We've learned today that architecture, no matter how grand, is always temporary in a long enough timeline. Needs change. Economics change. So when today's ultra-luxury 24-to-1 ratio super slender glass towers eventually become obsolete or perhaps structurally compromised in 100 or 200 years, how will future generations creatively adapt and reuse them?
That is a profound question.
What does the High Line of the 22nd century look like when the abandoned ruins aren't 30 feet off the ground, but 1,400 feet in the air? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of New York City. Keep looking up, and we'll catch you next time.